The city woke up slowly, like an animal stretching in the morning sun. The streets, still damp with last night's rain, whispered secrets to the pavement as the sound of distant traffic filled the air. The world seemed to move without noticing the small, quiet things, like the boy in the wheelchair, whose dark skin blended into the shadows of the alleyway. His name was Jamal. He was used to it. The stares, the whispers, the way the world seemed to ignore him, or worse, mock him. It wasn't just the wheelchair. It was the way people saw him. Black, disabled, weak. He could feel it every time someone walked past. Every time someone glanced his way with that look in their eyes. The one that said he wasn't worth their time, that he didn't belong. But Jamal had learned to ignore it. He had no choice. He wheeled himself down the cracked sidewalk, his mind miles away from the noise of the city. His thoughts drifted to the dream he had the night before. The dream where he could run, where his legs worked, where the world didn't feel like it was closing in around him. He wanted to escape. Just for a moment, but that was a dream, and dreams weren't real. Not for him. As he passed a run-down cafe, he heard a voice behind him. "Hey, kid!" Jamal stiffened. He knew that voice. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. It was Officer Blake, the same officer who had made Jamal's life hell for the past year. The one who took pleasure in reminding him that people like him didn't deserve the same respect as everyone else. Officer Blake was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his arrogance like a badge. He'd been making Jamal's life miserable since the first time they crossed paths. Jamal gripped the handles of his wheelchair a little tighter, willing himself not to show fear. But it was there, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. "What's the matter, cripple? Can't even walk?" Blake's voice was low, taunting. Jamal didn't answer. He knew better than to engage, but Blake was relentless. He sauntered closer, his boots scraping against the pavement, the sound as sharp as a knife. "What's it like, huh? Sitting there, stuck in that chair, like a puppet with broken strings," Blake sneered, circling Jamal, as though he were some animal to be toyed with. "Must be nice, not having to deal with real life." Jamal's fingers curled into fists. The pain in his legs was nothing compared to the rage bubbling up inside him. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to make Blake understand, but he couldn't. Not like this. Blake laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "I should have known better than to waste my time with you. You're just another one of them, aren't you?" Another one of them. The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. Another one of them. Black, weak, worthless. Jamal felt his face flush, his body trembling with frustration. He hated this feeling. The helplessness, the humiliation. He hated the way Blake made him feel so small. But what could he do? What could a kid in a wheelchair do against someone like him? And then, just as Blake leaned in closer, his face twisted into that smug grin. Something shifted in the air. A distant sound. A low growl rolled through the street. Jamal didn't know why, but the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He froze, eyes darting around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. But all he could see were the empty streets, the silent buildings, the indifferent world. Blake didn't hear it. He was too busy enjoying himself, too caught up in his power over Jamal. But then it happened again. A sharp, eerie howl split the air, sending a chill down Jamal's spine. It wasn't an animal's cry. It wasn't a dog. It was something primal. Something wild. Blake turned, his confident expression faltering for the briefest moment. "What's that?" he muttered under his breath. Jamal didn't answer. His heart raced. Something was coming. Something dangerous. Blake stepped back, scanning the street with uncertainty creeping into his features. "What the hell?" And then, through the thickening tension, it came. A shadow moved swiftly, silently, from behind a corner. Large, sleek, and deadly. Jamal's eyes widened as the figure emerged. A wolf, a trained wolf, its eyes glowing like embers in the dim light. It stood tall, its muscles rippling beneath its fur, moving with an eerie confidence. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Blake's smirk vanished as the wolf's eyes locked onto him. The street, once so familiar and safe, now felt like a trap, as if the world itself had changed in an instant. Blake's hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't move. Fear began to creep into his voice. "Stay back! Stay back!" Blake shouted, but the wolf didn't flinch. Jamal watched, heart pounding, as the situation spiraled into something far beyond his control. And then, the wolf let out another growl, louder this time, more menacing. The sound echoed off the walls, a reminder that this was no longer just a game. It was real, and it wasn't just Jamal who was powerless anymore. The wolf's growl reverberated in Jamal's chest, each vibration a warning to both him and the officer. The animal's eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, as if it could see deeper into the world than any human ever could. It wasn't just an animal, it was a force of nature. And in that moment, it made Blake look like nothing more than a frightened, confused man. Blake's hand, still hovering over his gun, trembled slightly. The wolf, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward with calculated grace, its muscles rippling beneath its fur. The animal's gaze never left Blake, who now took a few cautious steps back. The cool morning air felt heavier, suffocating even, as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on them both. Jamal felt the tension in the air. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he felt something change, something he couldn't explain. For the first time, it wasn't just him in the spotlight. Officer Blake, the man who had made Jamal's life a nightmare, was the one who was vulnerable. It was a strange sense of power that Jamal hadn't expected to feel, and yet, it also made him uneasy. For the past year, Officer Blake had been a constant shadow in his life, a reminder of everything he hated about the world. Blake had made it clear that Jamal, just by existing in his skin, was nothing more than a nuisance, an inconvenience to be put down at every opportunity. The insults, the taunts, the brutal treatment, all of it was designed to make Jamal feel small, worthless, invisible. "You're nothing," Blake had said one day as he shoved Jamal's wheelchair out of his way. "You're just a piece of garbage that doesn't belong in this world. People like you don't deserve respect. You'll never be anything." Those words had stayed with Jamal. They haunted him, followed him into the quiet corners of his mind, twisting and gnawing at his confidence. But today, in the face of this animal, something shifted. Blake continued to take slow, deliberate steps backward, his eyes darting between the wolf and the seemingly harmless figure in the wheelchair. The officer's bravado was slipping away, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. It was strange. He had been the one holding all the power, the one with the badge, the gun, the authority to hurt and humiliate. But now, here he was, facing something that couldn't be controlled with a weapon or a uniform. Jamal's heart raced. Was this really happening? Was this just some twisted dream that his mind had conjured up to escape the reality of his own helplessness? He could feel the cold sweat on his forehead, the grip on his wheelchair tightening. But it wasn't just fear that made him shake. It was the unknown. The fear of the power that had shifted in this moment. The fear of what would come next. But it wasn't just Blake who was afraid. Jamal realized that, in this frozen moment, he was afraid too. He had spent so long in the shadow of his own fear that, in the presence of this beast, he couldn't help but wonder if he was just as trapped as Blake. What if this wasn't about justice, or revenge, or some twisted sense of balance? What if it was just chaos? Blake finally spoke, his voice ragged, barely above a whisper. "Get back, you stupid animal. He didn't get to finish his sentence. In one swift motion, the wolf lunged, a blur of muscle and teeth. Blake barely had time to draw his gun before the wolf was on him, its powerful jaws snapping just inches from his face. The officer stumbled back, his hand still on his holster, but he was too slow, too distracted by the sudden terror. His legs gave out from under him, and he crashed onto the pavement with a sickening thud. Jamal's eyes widened in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. The wolf didn't tear into Blake, didn't maul him in the way a wild animal might. Instead, it stood over him, its teeth bared, its growl low and menacing, as if daring Blake to make the wrong move. The officer, now on his knees, stared up at the beast with wide eyes, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Jamal's pulse thundered in his ears, but he couldn't look away. The power dynamic had shifted. Blake, the man who had always made Jamal feel small, was now the one who was powerless. And Jamal, despite being just a teenager in a wheelchair, couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. But that satisfaction was short-lived. "You can't do this!" Blake hissed through gritted teeth, his eyes darting between the wolf and Jamal. You think he will protect you? You're nothing but a worthless, crippled—" The words cut off as Blake's gaze flickered downward, meeting the wolf's eyes. The officer's mouth went dry, his confidence shattering in an instant. The wolf wasn't backing down. It didn't care about his threats, his insults, his position of power. It was beyond that. And in that moment, Blake understood that his words, his authority, meant nothing in the face of something truly wild, something truly uncontrollable. For the first time in months, Jamal felt a strange sense of liberation. Blake had tried to reduce him to nothing, tried to make him feel small and insignificant, but now he was the one on his knees, groveling for mercy. It was a bitter, twisted taste of revenge, but it was enough to make Jamal feel like he had regained some semblance of control over his life. Still, he didn't know what was going to happen next. The tension in the air was thick, the stillness oppressive. Blake was still on the ground, hands trembling as he looked up at the wolf, and Jamal's mind raced with thoughts of what could come next. What would this wolf do? What would happen to Blake? Would he get up, brush himself off, and return to being the same sadistic, racist officer he had always been? Or was this moment going to change everything? And then, from the corner of his eye, Jamal saw something that made his blood run cold. A car, black and sleek, came to a stop just a few yards away. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that looked far too expensive for this part of the city. His presence was immediate, demanding. His eyes locked onto the wolf, and for a brief moment, Jamal felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. This man was not afraid. In fact, he looked almost pleased. "Is it done?" the man asked, his voice smooth, cold, like a blade sliding across steel. The wolf didn't move. It simply stood there, its gaze still fixed on Blake, who was now barely able to breathe, his body trembling with fear. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man? What was going on? The man took a few slow steps toward Blake, his eyes never leaving the officer. "You've been a problem for far too long, Officer Blake," he said, his tone cold and controlled. "But I suppose that's no longer an issue." Jamal could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The fear, the confusion, the overwhelming sense that nothing in this world was as it seemed. He had thought this was his moment, his chance to see Blake brought to his knees, to finally feel some justice for all the years of suffering. But now, with this man standing there, it was clear that Jamal wasn't the one in control after all. "Take care of him," the man said softly. The wolf didn't hesitate. It stepped back from Blake, giving the officer just enough space to scramble to his feet. But before he could run, the wolf moved again, faster than Jamal could process. It lunged forward, and this time there was no hesitation, no mercy. The officer screamed, the sound piercing through the thick silence of the street. But it didn't matter. The wolf was already upon him. Jamal closed his eyes, unable to watch the brutal scene unfold in front of him. The sounds of struggle and pain filled the air, but he didn't dare open his eyes. He had seen enough. In that moment, Jamal realized something crucial. The world was never going to be fair. There were no happy endings, no neat resolutions. The system that had built itself on hatred, on cruelty, on racism, would never simply crumble. It would shift, evolve, twist, until it found a new form of oppression, a new way to keep the cycle going. And he was just one small, powerless piece in that cycle. But for the first time, Jamal wasn't sure if he could live with that. Jamal sat motionless in his wheelchair, the streetlights casting long shadows across his face as the sound of Blake's screams slowly faded into the distance. His hands still gripped the cold metal of the wheelchair, the knuckles white with the force of his tension. His chest rose and fell with each breath, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Blake, the man who had mocked him, humiliated him, treated him like an invisible object, was gone, torn apart by the very creature that had appeared out of nowhere. But the relief he should have felt was absent, replaced instead by an overwhelming sense of unease. Blake's cries had stopped, but something else had emerged in the aftermath. A vacuum, a deep, suffocating silence that pressed down on Jamal like a weight, a feeling of isolation more profound than anything he had experienced before. It was as if the world had become even more indifferent to him, more out of reach than it had been before. Jamal had never felt more alone. The man in the expensive suit stood there, his back to Jamal, seemingly indifferent to the violence he had just orchestrated. His presence loomed over the scene, casting a shadow that seemed to eclipse everything around them. The wolf, once wild and uncontrolled, had now become a mere extension of this man, standing obediently at his side, its yellow eyes flickering toward Jamal for a brief moment before returning to its silent vigilance. "Is it over?" Jamal asked, his voice unsteady, unsure if the words were even meant for the man or for himself. His heart was racing, still shaken by the brutality he had just witnessed, still processing what had just happened. The man didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward Jamal, his expression unreadable. His suit, impeccably tailored, gleamed under the streetlights as he moved. Every movement was measured, every step a silent affirmation of his authority. When he spoke, his voice was as cold and polished as the glass on his cufflinks. "It's never over," he said, his gaze never leaving Jamal. "It's just a chapter, and the story isn't over yet." Jamal felt his stomach tighten at the man's words. He wasn't sure what he meant by that, but there was a sense of finality in his tone, a finality that made Jamal feel small, like a pawn in a game that was far beyond his comprehension. The man didn't wait for a response. Instead, he nodded toward the wolf, which immediately moved, its large frame moving silently through the shadows as it disappeared into the night. For a brief moment, Jamal thought he saw something in the wolf's eyes, a glimmer of understanding, a connection that felt almost human. But before he could analyze it further, the man turned his attention back to him. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" The man's question was not one of curiosity, but rather one of observation. He wasn't asking Jamal's permission to speak. He wasn't looking for a response. He was simply stating a fact. Jamal said nothing, still trying to process the confusion and chaos that had just unfolded. His mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, questions, and emotions. How had it come to this? How had Blake, the man who had so casually destroyed his spirit for months, been brought down so easily? And why had the man in the suit allowed it to happen? "You know," the man continued, his voice a smooth whisper, "I've been watching you for a while. I've seen how you move through this city, the way people look at you, the way they don't see you." Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure whether he was more unnerved by the man's words or the fact that he had been watched. He had always known that the world saw him as something less, something weaker. It wasn't just Blake, it was everyone. The teachers who ignored him, the kids who passed him by as if he didn't exist, the strangers who wouldn't make eye contact with him in public. He had learned long ago that the world didn't care about people like him, that in the grand scheme of things, his existence didn't matter. But hearing those words from the man felt like something different. He wasn't just describing the reality Jamal had lived. He was observing it from a distance, as if he could see something more, something deeper than even Jamal himself understood. "They don't see me," Jamal muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign as they left his lips, but they were true. "No one ever sees me." The man smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was calculating. Cold. "No, they don't. They see the wheelchair. They see the color of your skin. They see a broken, worthless boy who has no future, no power. They see the labels that have been placed on you, and they believe them." Jamal's chest tightened. He knew that feeling all too well. He had spent his entire life being seen through a lens of prejudice and ignorance. He was the disabled kid, the black kid, the one who didn't belong, who wasn't good enough. The world had never bothered to see him as more than a set of circumstances, more than a stereotype. The man took a step closer, his presence overpowering. But you're not like them. You don't have to be like them. You can be more. You can be something they'll never understand. Jamal looked up at him, confused, anger rising within him like a slow-burning fire. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "What is this? What do you want me to do? What do you want from a kid in a chair who's nothing but a target for people like Blake?" The man's eyes flickered for a moment, as though he had expected Jamal's anger. "I don't want you to do anything," he said, his tone softening just slightly. "I want to show you something. I want to show you the power that's been waiting inside you all along." Jamal's mind reeled. Power inside him? How could this man talk about power when Jamal had spent his entire life struggling, trying to survive in a world that didn't give a damn about him? He had been powerless, invisible, a victim. But the man didn't give him time to respond. He simply turned, his back now facing Jamal as he moved toward the alleyway. "Come with me," he called over his shoulder, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. "If you want to understand what true power is, come with me." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, 1,000 thoughts swirling in his mind. He didn't know who this man was, or what he wanted, or what kind of world he was offering. All he knew was that nothing in his life had ever felt more uncertain, more dangerous. But something about the man's words, his unshakable confidence, stirred something deep inside Jamal. Was this a chance? A chance to finally escape the chains of fear and helplessness? Or was this just another cruel trap? Another way for the world to tear him down? For a moment, Jamal didn't move. He sat there, unsure of what to do, unsure of where this path would lead. He had always been taught to trust no one, to keep his head down, to survive. But this man was offering something more than survival. He was offering power. Without thinking, Jamal pushed his wheelchair forward, following the man into the darkness. The path ahead was unclear, the road uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, Jamal felt like he was stepping into something larger than himself. He wasn't sure where this would take him, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay where he was. Not anymore. And so, he followed. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on the rest of this journey. Now, let's continue. The night swallowed them whole. Jamal's wheelchair scraped along the cracked pavement, the sound of its metal wheels echoing in the silence that hung heavy in the air. The man in the suit walked ahead, his pace steady and unhurried, as if he were completely at ease in the darkness. Jamal followed, his heart racing, unsure of what was to come. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn back, to return to the safety of the world he knew, where he could keep his head down and try to survive. But something inside him, something he couldn't explain, compelled him to keep going. As they moved deeper into the shadows, Jamal's mind churned. Who was this man? What did he want from him? And what did he mean by power? The questions swirled in his head, each one feeding the uncertainty that gripped his chest. But despite his fear, despite his hesitation, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment he had been waiting for. A chance to escape the life of quiet suffering he had known. A chance to see the world through a different lens, one that wasn't clouded by the prejudice and hatred that had always defined his existence. The man stopped suddenly, turning on his heel to face Jamal. For the first time since they had started walking, his expression softened, though the coldness never quite left his eyes. "You're wondering why I brought you here," the man said, his voice measured, almost soothing. "But the truth is, you've been here all along. You've always been here. You just didn't know it yet." Jamal furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man stepped closer, crouching down to meet Jamal's gaze. "You think you're alone. You think that because the world sees you as weak, as nothing, that you're invisible. But that's not true. You've just been playing by their rules. And in doing so, you've allowed them to control you. Jamal shook his head. I don't understand. You don't have to, the man said with a smile, though it was more a bare acknowledgement than any warmth. Not yet, but you will. You will, soon enough. The man turned, motioning for Jamal to follow him into an alleyway that seemed to swallow all light. The walls on either side were covered in graffiti, some of it political, some of it barely legible, symbolic of the city's hidden truths, its unspoken realities. Jamal wheeled forward, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. There was something ominous about this place, as if the shadows themselves held secrets they weren't ready to reveal. You've lived your life under their watch, the man continued, his voice now carrying a hint of something darker, something more dangerous. Under their control, people like Blake, they're the enforcers, the ones who make sure you stay in your place. Jamal's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair, his fingers digging into the metal. He didn't need the man to explain that. He had felt it every single day of his life. The world, it seemed, had been designed to remind him of his place, at the bottom. He had seen the way people looked at him, heard the whispers behind his back, felt the sneers of strangers as they judged him before even getting close enough to see who he really was. People like him, people like you, they'll always be there, the man said, his tone hardening. They're the ones who keep the system in place. They're the ones who make sure that someone like you can't rise above the labels that have been placed on you. Jamal felt a spark of anger ignite within him, an anger that had been building for years, a fire that had been smouldering under the surface of his soul. You think I don't know that? You think I don't know how they see me? His voice trembled with the weight of years of frustration. They see me as nothing, a kid in a wheelchair, a black kid, broken, worthless. The man looked at him, his eyes piercing, as if he could see right through Jamal's facade. Exactly, he said quietly, his words hanging in the air like a weight. But that's not who you are. You're more than that. Jamal shook his head, disbelief creeping into his voice. How could I be more than that? The world has already decided what I am, and I don't think that's ever going to change. The man studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words, before he spoke again. The world doesn't decide who you are. You do. You've been given a role to play in their game, but that doesn't mean you have to accept it. You're not broken. You're not worthless. You're just waiting. Waiting for what? Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a thin smile. For the storm. Jamal furrowed his brow, confused. The storm? Yes, the man said, his voice carrying a new intensity. The storm. The chaos that will tear everything apart. The chaos that will give you the freedom you've been looking for. But first, you need to understand what you're capable of. The words sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. The storm. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt a strange sense of inevitability in the man's words. The storm was coming, and Jamal, he would be a part of it. But what if I don't want this? Jamal asked, his voice shaky, the weight of everything pressing down on him. What if I just want to live a normal life? What if I just want to be left alone? The man regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Do you think they'll leave you alone? Do you think Blake and people like him will ever let you live a normal life? The system is built to crush people like you, people who are different, people who don't fit the mold. You can try to survive in their world, but they will always keep you down. They will always remind you that you don't belong. Jamal opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He knew it was true. He had seen it time and time again. People like him, people who didn't fit society's narrow definition of what was normal, were always pushed to the edges, always made to feel like they didn't belong. The man's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. But you don't have to live in that world anymore. You can break free. You can take control of your life. You can stop waiting for the world to change and make it change on your terms. Jamal's heart raced, and for the first time in his life, he felt something stir within him, a feeling that he couldn't quite place. Hope. It felt strange, foreign, almost wrong. He had spent so long feeling like he was fighting a losing battle that the idea of taking control seemed impossible. laughable even. But the man was right. Everything he had ever been told, by society, by people like Blake, had been a lie. He wasn't broken. He wasn't worthless. He had power, a power he had never known existed. You need to understand, the man continued, his voice low and steady, that there is a world beyond the one they've forced you to live in. And the only way to break free from it is to embrace the storm, to let it consume you and reshape you into something greater, something they will never see coming. Jamal felt the weight of the man's words settle over him. The storm. It was the key. But what would it mean for him? What would it mean for everything he had known? The man stepped closer, his hand resting on the back of Jamal's wheelchair. The first step is to stop caring about what they think. You've already let them define you, but it's time to change that. You don't need their approval. You don't need their pity. You don't need their understanding. You only need yourself. Jamal stared ahead, feeling the truth of the man's words settling deep within him. He had spent his entire life trying to gain acceptance, trying to make people see him as more than just a black kid in a wheelchair. But the truth was, no matter how hard he tried, it was never enough. They would never see him for who he truly was. They would never see him at all. It was time to stop trying to fit into a world that wasn't built for him. It was time to break free. But as Jamal turned to speak, something in the air shifted. A cold wind blew through the alleyway, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The man looked at him, his eyes narrowing as if sensing something on the horizon. The storm was coming, and it would change everything. Jamal wasn't ready for what would come next, but there was no turning back now. The storm was already on its way. The wind howled through the alley, a sharp, cold gust that felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as he felt the air shift, the sense of something inevitable growing stronger with each passing second. The man in the suit stood there, unmoving, as if the storm, whatever it truly was, had already begun in his mind. There was a stillness in him, a quiet certainty that only made Jamal feel more like an outsider, as if he was standing on the edge of something far beyond his understanding. Jamal glanced up at him, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now? What do you want me to do?" The man's gaze softened, though it still held the cold, calculating edge that had marked their earlier conversation. "You're asking the wrong question, Jamal. It's not about what I want. It's about what you need to do. And more importantly, it's about who you need to become." Jamal's heart raced. He wasn't sure what the man meant. He had heard those words before, those promises of power and freedom, but they had always seemed like lies, lies told by people who wanted something from him, who wanted to use him for their own purposes. He had seen it too many times, felt it too deeply, but something in the man's eyes made Jamal hesitate. There was no malice in his gaze. There was no trickery. There was only a quiet, dangerous truth. A truth Jamal wasn't sure he was ready to face. The man continued, his voice a low murmur against the backdrop of the howling wind. "The world you live in, the one that has tried to break you, to tear you down, to strip you of your humanity, it doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about people like you. It never has. It sees you as weak, as broken, as something to be discarded when it's no longer useful." Jamal's fists clenched in his lap. The anger inside him was like a fire burning through his veins, relentless and unforgiving. He had heard it all before. The dismissive words, the mockery, the pity that was always there, just beneath the surface of every interaction. People like Blake, people like so many others, had made it clear to him every day that he didn't belong, that his existence was a burden to them, that he was just a problem, a distraction. "Yeah, I know," Jamal muttered, his voice barely audible. "I've heard it all before, every day. I'm the kid in the chair. I'm the black kid. I'm the one who doesn't matter." The man looked at him, his eyes narrowing as if he were measuring each word Jamal spoke. "And how much longer are you going to let them define you, Jamal? How much longer are you going to let them write your story? How much longer will you let them decide your fate?" Jamal's breath hitched. He didn't know how to respond. He had spent his entire life playing by their rules, trying to survive in a world that had made it clear he was nothing more than a statistic, a label. He had learned to keep his head down, to accept the insults, the mockery, the looks of pity. He had learned to disappear into the background, to become invisible to the world that never saw him as anything more than a stereotype. But the man in front of him, he was offering something different, something dangerous, something Jamal wasn't sure he was ready for. "You're not invisible, Jamal," the man said, his voice steady and cold. "Not anymore, but you've been hiding in plain sight. You've been playing their game, letting them set the rules, and it's time for that to end. The world won't change for you. You have to make it change." Jamal stared at the man, a whirlwind of emotions colliding inside him. The fear, the anger, the resentment. It was all there, swirling in his chest, but beneath it was something else, something he couldn't quite place. Hope? Desperation? He didn't know. But what he did know was that the man was right. The world wasn't going to change, not unless he made it. "Okay," Jamal said, his voice shaky but firm. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll stop hiding. I'll stop pretending I don't care." The man nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good, that's the first step. But there's more. You need to embrace the storm. You need to stop thinking like them. Stop thinking like the people who have spent their whole lives telling you that you don't matter. Stop thinking like the ones who have made you feel like you're less than human. You are not them. You are not what they say you are. You are more." Jamal's mind spun. What did it mean to stop thinking like them? To stop caring about what they said? The very idea felt foreign, impossible even. But the fire inside him, this strange, unfamiliar sense of defiance, made him want to try. He had nothing left to lose. "You need to understand something," the man continued, his tone growing darker, more intense. "The world is built on a system of power, and right now they hold all the power. People like Blake, they thrive in this system. They are the enforcers. They are the ones who keep everyone in their place. But you," the man's eyes locked onto Jamal's with a piercing gaze, "you have the power to break that system, to destroy it, to turn it all on its head." Jamal swallowed hard. The idea was too much to process, too much to believe. How could he, a kid in a wheelchair, possibly break the system? The very system that had been designed to keep people like him down. The man stepped forward, his hand resting on the back of Jamal's wheelchair once again. "You think they see you as nothing, and maybe in their eyes you are. But they are wrong. You are everything. You are the catalyst for change. You are the one who will show them that the system they've built, the one they've used to oppress people like you, is fragile. It can be broken." Jamal felt the weight of the man's words sink in, deeper than anything he had ever heard. He felt the truth in them, but he also felt the weight of their consequences. Breaking the system. It sounded impossible. It sounded dangerous. But it also sounded like something Jamal had been yearning for his entire life. A chance to make the world see him, to make them understand that he was more than just a label, more than just the sum of his circumstances. A chance to make the world feel the pain he had felt, the suffering, the humiliation. A chance to make them pay for all the years of his life they had stolen from him. "I can't do this alone," Jamal said, his voice quieter now, but filled with a quiet resolve. "I don't know how." "You're not alone," the man replied. "You have the strength within you. You just need to unlock it. The storm is coming, Jamal. It's coming for all of them. And when it hits, they won't know what hit them." Jamal took a deep breath, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. The storm was coming. The chaos was inevitable. And he was going to be a part of it. "You're ready," the man said, his voice firm. "The storm is already inside you. Now it's time to let it out." And with those words, Jamal felt it. The spark that had been hidden deep within him for so long. The power that had always been there, waiting for him to recognize it. It surged to the surface, and in that moment, Jamal knew that everything was about to change. The storm was here, and he was ready. But as the man turned and began walking away, Jamal couldn't help but feel the weight of the choice he had made. There was no going back now. The storm was coming, and nothing would be the same again. Jamal wheeled forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he had control. And that was enough. For now. The city had never felt more oppressive. Every street, every corner, every shadow seemed to weigh on Jamal's shoulders like a heavy burden, the weight of his decision now pressing down on him with the full force of reality. He had thought he was prepared, that the storm would bring some kind of clarity, but instead, the chaos of his own mind had deepened. The man in the suit had shown him the power that lay dormant inside him, but now Jamal wasn't sure what to do with it. The world he had always known, one of suffering, of humiliation, of being nothing more than a label, was crumbling around him. But what was replacing it? What kind of person was he becoming in the pursuit of this power? The streets of the city were eerily quiet as Jamal wheeled through them, the sound of his chair's wheels a sharp, jarring contrast to the silence that enveloped him. He had been so focused on breaking free, on taking control of his own fate, that he hadn't stopped to consider what would happen once he did. The power the man had spoken of, it wasn't just an abstract concept. It was real. It was inside him. And now that it was unlocked, Jamal could feel it stirring, like a beast that had been caged for too long. But with it came a growing sense of alienation. He was no longer the boy who had suffered silently. He had taken the first step into a new world, one where he wasn't bound by the chains of racism, where he didn't have to accept the roles society had assigned him. But he didn't know how to navigate this new reality. He didn't know how to use the power he had discovered. And worse yet, he didn't know who he could trust. The world that had once seemed so familiar, so predictable, now felt foreign. Every passerby, every glance, every whispered word felt like a new threat. Jamal's eyes darted from person to person, as if expecting the world to turn on him at any moment. He'd spent his whole life trying to avoid the hatred, trying to survive the insults and the cruelty that people like Blake had thrown at him. But now, with the storm inside him, with the power he had embraced, he wasn't sure if he could hide anymore. The very act of standing up, of asserting his presence, made him a target. And the worst part was, he was beginning to feel like he deserved it. "Look at him," a voice murmured from behind Jamal. He turned slightly, his gaze falling on two men standing across the street. One of them, a white man in a dark hoodie, smirked as he looked at Jamal, his eyes glinting with disdain. "Just another one of them. Thinks he's better than everyone else just because he's in that chair." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The words stung, but they weren't new. He had heard them all his life, the whispered insults that came whenever he passed by people who didn't see him as a person, just an obstacle, a problem. But today it felt different. Today, the hatred in their eyes felt more real, more dangerous. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they looked at him, the way they saw him as something less than human, something they could dismiss with a glance. "Yeah, doesn't even belong out here," the other man added, his voice thick with contempt. "Just stay in your damn chair, where you can't hurt anyone." The words were like daggers, sharp and precise. They sliced through the fragile barrier Jamal had built around himself, the one that had kept him from succumbing to the darkness that always seemed to follow him. The power he had gained, the storm he had embraced, it was supposed to give him control, to free him from the chains of the past. But all it seemed to do was magnify the hate, the ugliness, the cruelty that the world had always shown him. Jamal felt his hands tighten around the wheels of his chair, the metal digging into his palms. He had a choice now. He could let their words slide off him, like water off a duck's back. He could keep walking, keep moving forward, pretending that nothing had changed. Or he could do something about it. He could make them feel the same way he had felt all these years, the pain, the humiliation, the anger. He could break their illusions, shatter the comfortable reality they had built for themselves. He glanced up at the men, his eyes burning with an intensity he hadn't known he was capable of. For a moment, the world around him seemed to freeze. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of cars, the murmur of voices, All of it faded into the background. All that mattered was the look in those men's eyes, the way they had reduced him to nothing. He could feel the storm inside him rising, a torrent of fury and frustration that he could no longer ignore. "What did you say?" Jamal's voice was low, almost a growl, but there was something in it, a dangerous edge, a promise of something more. The men paused, momentarily thrown off guard by the sudden change in his demeanor. They had expected him to cower, to shrink back into his chair, to remain the powerless, invisible figure they had always known. But Jamal wasn't the same anymore. One of the men, the one in the hoodie, took a step forward. His smirk remained, but it was less confident now, more uncertain. "You heard me, freak," he spat. "You think you can come out here and just—" Before he could finish, Jamal's hand shot out, gripping the front wheel of his chair, and he spun it around with a force that sent him flying toward the man. The action was so sudden, so violent, that the man took a step back, startled. But Jamal wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his face inches from the man's, his voice a razor-sharp whisper. "You think I'm a freak? You think I'm less than you?" Jamal's words dripped with venom, and the storm inside him crashed against the walls of his chest, threatening to spill over. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." The man's eyes flickered with fear now. For the first time, he wasn't looking at Jamal as a weak target. He was looking at him as someone who could actually hurt him. "Get the hell away from me," the man stammered, his bravado slipping away. But Jamal didn't move. He stayed there holding the man's gaze, his mind racing with a mix of emotions: anger, hate, the need for justice. But there was something else there too, something he hadn't expected, the satisfaction of seeing this man who had always considered him beneath him, who had always seen him as a joke, finally realize that he wasn't. The second man, seeing his companion faltering, took a step back. "Yo, man, chill," he said, his voice tinged with panic. "We don't want any trouble." But Jamal wasn't listening. The power inside him, the storm, was surging now, drowning out every other thought. He wasn't going to let them walk away. Not after everything they had said. Not after everything he had endured. They had no right to look at him that way. No right to reduce him to something less than human. "No," Jamal said, his voice cold and unwavering. "You don't get to walk away this time." He pushed himself forward with brutal force, ramming his chair into the first man's legs, knocking him back a few steps. The man yelped in surprise, his arrogance shattering. But Jamal wasn't done. He felt the storm inside him grow, the power swelling in his chest, and for the first time in his life, he realized something terrifying. This was the beginning of something. This was the moment when he stopped being the victim, stopped being the one who had to hide in the shadows, stopped being the one who accepted the labels others put on him. Jamal wasn't just fighting for respect anymore. He was fighting for his existence, fighting for the right to be seen, to be heard, fighting for the right to take control of his own life, his own narrative. The second man turned to flee, but Jamal wasn't about to let him go either. "I'm not done with you," he said, his voice sharp, cold, and unyielding. He pushed forward again, moving faster than the man could react, and grabbed his arm, spinning him around. "What's your problem, man?" the man gasped, his face twisted in fear. Jamal's grip tightened. "My problem," he said, the words coming out in a low, dangerous growl. "You, all of you. You think you can treat me like I'm nothing, like I'm less than you. Well, I'm not, and I'm done letting you think that I am." The man trembled in his grasp, his bravado long gone. The storm that had been unleashed inside Jamal was no longer a distant force. It was here, in full force, and he wasn't backing down. "You want to treat me like I'm invisible?" Jamal said, his voice rising with each word. "Well, I'm not invisible anymore." The man, now terrified, yanked his arm free and stumbled backward. Jamal let him go. He didn't need to keep him there. The point had been made. The fear in the man's eyes was all the confirmation he needed. Jamal watched them retreat, both men now clearly shaken, unsure of what had just happened. As they disappeared into the distance, Jamal stayed in place, his chest heaving with the adrenaline, his mind still spinning. He had done it. He had made them see him. But as the storm inside him began to settle, The question that remained was whether this was just the beginning of a new path or the start of something darker. Jamal wheeled himself forward, feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. The storm was just beginning, and there was no going back. The streets felt different now. They were no longer the simple backdrop to Jamal's daily existence. The once familiar sidewalks, the corners of the city he had passed by without a second thought. Now they all seemed charged with a palpable tension. Every glance, every whisper, every lingering stare felt like it was loaded with meaning, loaded with consequences. The world he had once known, where he had been little more than a shadow, was now reacting to him. He wasn't invisible anymore, and while part of him felt a sense of power in that, another part of him felt like he was standing on the edge of something far darker. The encounter with the two men in the alley had left him shaken, but in a way, it had also awakened something inside him, a hunger. For too long, he had been the one who suffered in silence, the one who was beaten down by the weight of his own existence. But now, for the first time, Jamal had a sense of control. He had let the storm inside him roar, and it had felt good. It had felt like justice. But there was a dangerous edge to that feeling, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. It wasn't just the physical altercation with those men. It was everything. The years of humiliation, the constant reminder that he was different, less than, that had finally begun to break through the walls he had built around himself. It had taken a long time for him to realize it, but now he understood. All the insults, the slights, the mocking smiles, the cruel comments, they weren't just about him. They were about the system that had been built to keep him in his place. A system that had been designed to remind people like him that they were nothing more than pawns in a game they could never win. But now, Jamal was starting to see it differently. He wasn't a pawn. He was a player, and it was time to take the game into his own hands. Jamal wheeled through the city streets, his mind racing. He had never been a part of something bigger than himself. He had always been alone in his struggle, always isolated by the world that refused to accept him. But now, as the storm inside him grew, he began to feel the weight of his choices. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, for everyone who had ever been pushed to the edges of society, discarded because of their race, their disability, their very existence. The world had given him a role, a label. But it was time to rewrite that story. As he approached the corner of a busy street, Jamal caught sight of a group of young men gathered on the sidewalk. They were laughing, joking, a few of them leaning against a car. But as soon as they saw him, the mood shifted. The laughter died down, replaced by the familiar look of disdain. Jamal stopped in his tracks. He recognized one of the men, Trey, a guy from his school who had never missed an opportunity to remind Jamal of his place in the world. Trey was the kind of person who saw Jamal as nothing more than a charity case, someone to be pitied or mocked, but never respected. He had made it clear on more than one occasion that Jamal was nothing more than a token, a symbol of what was wrong with the world. But now, as Jamal stood there, facing Trey and the others, he didn't feel like the token anymore. He didn't feel like the charity case. He felt like he was staring at a reflection of everything he had come to hate. And in that moment, the storm inside him roared to life. Trey's smirk faltered as he recognized the look in Jamal's eyes. "What's up, cripple?" Trey sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Thought you'd just roll through here like you own the place?" Jamal didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He didn't shrink into the shadows. For the first time in his life, he stood his ground. "Yeah, I do own the place," Jamal said, his voice steady. But there was a sharpness to it that made everyone around him take a step back. "And I'm done letting people like you tell me where I belong." Trey's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like he might laugh. But then something shifted in his expression. A flicker of something. Something Jamal couldn't quite place, but it wasn't amusement. It was something else. Fear, maybe. Or maybe it was the realization that Jamal wasn't the same kid he used to be. "What the hell are you talking about, man?" Trey asked, his voice no longer dripping with mockery. "You're still just a crippled freak in a chair." Jamal felt the insult sting, but this time it didn't cut as deep. He was tired of being their punching bag. tired of being reduced to a stereotype, to something less than human. The power inside him surged, and he felt it, felt the storm swirling around him, building, until it was almost too much to contain. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Jamal's voice was low now, but there was a coldness to it that sent a shiver down Trey's spine. "You think I'm just a freak, just some guy you can make fun of? Well, I'm done with that. I'm done being the butt of your jokes. I'm done being invisible." Trey took a step forward, but the fear was clear now. Jamal could see it in his eyes. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to Jamal standing up to him, and that terrified him. "You need to back off, man," Trey said, his voice shaky. "I don't know what kind of shit you've been going through, but I don't care what you think," Jamal cut him off. His voice was sharper now, like a blade that had been waiting to strike. "You don't get to define me anymore. You don't get to make me feel like I'm nothing. I'm not your joke. I'm not your charity case. And I'm not going to sit back and let people like you think they can treat me like shit." The group of men behind Trey had fallen silent, watching Jamal with a mix of confusion and fear. They weren't used to seeing him this way. They weren't used to seeing anyone stand up to them, least of all someone like Jamal. And for the first time, Jamal realized something that made his heart race. He had their attention. He had power. "You don't own this street," Jamal continued, his voice rising with each word. "And you don't own me. I'm not just here to survive anymore. I'm here to make sure you never forget who I am." There was a long pause, the air thick with tension. Trey opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Jamal wheeled himself forward, moving closer to him. The group of men watched, unsure of what was going to happen next. Trey took a step back, his eyes wide with uncertainty. But Jamal didn't stop. He didn't move away. He didn't back down. "You want to keep treating me like I'm less than you," Jamal said quietly. "Then keep walking. But know this. I'm not the same kid I was before. I'm not the one who's going to let you walk all over me anymore. I'm done letting you and people like you decide who I am." Trey was silent, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. The other men looked from Jamal to Trey, unsure of what to do. For a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. But Jamal didn't wait for them to make a move. He didn't need to. With a final, sharp glance, Jamal turned his chair around and wheeled away, leaving Trey and his group behind. He didn't need to prove anything to them. The storm inside him had already done its work, and for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of that power, not as a curse, but as a blessing. But as Jamal rolled down the street, a dark thought lingered in the back of his mind. He had stood up to Trey. He had taken control, but what would it cost him? The storm had only just begun to show its true power, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. He wasn't sure what kind of man he would become. But there was no turning back now. He had broken the chains. The world wouldn't let him go. The city was still and silent as Jamal wheeled down the street, his mind racing. The confrontation with Trey and his friends had left him shaken, but also emboldened. He had stood up to them, confronted them with a power he hadn't known he had until now. But as he made his way through the city, the weight of his actions began to settle on him. The storm inside him was still there, swirling beneath the surface, a constant reminder of the anger and frustration he had been carrying for so long. It was as if the very city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he wasn't fully prepared for. The confrontation with Trey had been just the beginning. But what came next? What would he do now that he had tasted the power of standing up for himself? The power of making people see him, of making them feel the weight of his presence. The world had always pushed him aside, treated him like he was invisible, like he was less than everyone else. But now, he wasn't invisible anymore, and that terrified him. As he turned a corner, he spotted a familiar figure standing across the street. It was Officer Blake, the very man who had tormented him for so long. The same officer who had looked at him with disgust, who had mocked him, who had reminded him every chance he got that he was nothing. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen Blake in weeks, but now here he was, standing in front of him, like a ghost from his past. Blake's eyes locked onto Jamal's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was something in Blake's expression that Jamal couldn't quite place. Something darker, more dangerous. It was a look that made his blood run cold. Blake's usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something else. Fear, discomfort, whatever it was clear that the balance had shifted. Jamal wasn't the same person Blake had once looked down on, and Blake knew it. "Jamal," Blake said, his voice cold but measured. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you out here again." Jamal didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Blake, his mind swirling with memories of all the times the officer had made him feel small, had made him feel like he didn't matter. The insults, the humiliations, the times he had been forced to endure Blake's mocking gaze, the times Blake had reminded him that he was nothing more than a disabled black kid, someone who would never be able to make it in a world built by people like him. But now, Jamal wasn't that kid anymore. The storm inside him had changed everything. He wasn't going to let Blake or anyone else tell him who he was. He wasn't going to let anyone make him feel small again. "You thought you could get away with it," Jamal said quietly, his voice low but filled with a quiet intensity. "You thought you could break me. You thought I was weak. But you were wrong." Blake's lips curled into a sneer, but there was something in his eyes, something Jamal had never seen before. Blake was used to being the one in control. He was used to making people like Jamal cower, to remind them of their place in the world. But now, with Jamal standing in front of him, unflinching, Blake didn't seem so sure of himself anymore. "Is that what you think?" Blake asked, his tone mocking, but there was a hint of uncertainty underneath. "You really think you're in control now?" Jamal didn't back down. He wheeled himself closer to Blake, the wheels of his chair cutting through the silence of the street. "I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's approval," Jamal said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm done letting people like you decide who I am. I'm done being the joke, done being invisible." Blake took a step forward, his hands tightening into fists. "You think I've been the problem? You think I'm the one who's been holding you down?" he spat. "You don't know anything about the world. You don't know what it's like to have power, to have control." Jamal stared at him, feeling a cold fire rise in his chest. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to have power. But I know what it's like to have everything stacked against me. And I'm done letting people like you push me around. You're the one who's been holding people like me down. You're the one who thinks you can decide who gets to have a life and who doesn't." Blake's face twisted with anger. "You think you're special now? Just because you stood up to a few guys on the street? You think you've earned something? You think I'm going to let you walk away from all the shit you've done?" Jamal's heart was racing now. He could feel the storm inside him building, that raw power he had tapped into earlier. The power to stand up, to fight back. He wasn't going to let Blake intimidate him anymore. He wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him. "I'm not like you," Jamal said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I'm not a racist, hateful piece of shit. I don't treat people like dirt just because they're different. And I'm done being afraid of people like you." Blake's eyes flashed with fury. He stepped closer, towering over Jamal, trying to impose his will, but Jamal refused to shrink away. He didn't need to back down anymore. Not from Blake. Not from anyone. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Blake sneered, his face inches from Jamal's. "You think you can just come out here and tell me what to do? You're nothing. You'll always be nothing. Just a crippled kid who thinks he can make a difference." The words stung, but they didn't hurt like they used to. Jamal had heard them before. From Blake. From everyone. But now they were nothing more than hollow echoes of a world that had tried to keep him small. "I'm not nothing," Jamal said quietly, his voice steady and unyielding. "And you're wrong. I'm not the one who's small. You are." Blake's jaw clenched, his fists shaking with rage. He stepped back, eyes narrowed with contempt. "You don't know who you're messing with, kid. I've got connections, people who'll make sure you stay in your place." Jamal met Blake's gaze, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and something else, something he couldn't quite describe. It was power. It was freedom. It was the knowledge that he didn't need to be afraid anymore. The storm inside him had already begun to take shape. It had already started to break the chains that had held him captive for so long. "I'm not afraid of your connections," Jamal said, his voice now firm, unwavering. "I'm not afraid of you. And I'm not afraid of the world that wants to keep me down. I'm done hiding. And I'm done letting you and people like you decide what I can and can't do." Blake's face turned red with anger, but he didn't make a move. For the first time, Jamal saw the fear in his eyes. The fear of someone who had spent their life abusing their power, only to find themselves facing something they couldn't control. Blake had never been confronted like this before. He had always been the one in charge. But now, with Jamal standing before him, the balance had shifted. And Blake didn't know how to handle it. "I'm done with you," Jamal said, turning his chair around. "And I'm done with people like you." As Jamal wheeled away, he could hear Blake's angry shouts behind him, but he didn't turn around. The storm inside him was still there, still raging, but it wasn't the same kind of storm anymore. It wasn't just about anger. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about something bigger. It was about taking back control of his life, about standing up and saying, "I matter." The road ahead was still uncertain. The world wasn't going to change overnight. But for the first time in his life, Jamal felt like he had the power to change it. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He wasn't just someone to be pushed aside. He was a force, and the world was going to have to deal with it. As Jamal rolled through the city, the storm inside him began to settle. But the fire still burned. It wasn't over. It had only just begun, and Jamal was ready. The city stretched before Jamal like a battlefield. The streets, once so familiar, now felt foreign to him. Each crack in the sidewalk, each turn of the corner, all seemed to pulse with an energy he hadn't noticed before. The world had changed since his confrontation with Trey, since that moment when he had realized that the power he'd been searching for was inside him all along. The anger that had always lived beneath the surface, the bitterness, the sense of being overlooked and dehumanized, had all come together, creating something explosive, something unstoppable. But with that realization came a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of weakness or fear of being oppressed. No, it was a fear of the unknown, fear of what he could become if he embraced this power completely. The storm inside him had opened his eyes to the world, but it had also forced him to confront the parts of himself he had never been willing to face. The rage, the need for vengeance, the desire to make everyone who had ever made him feel small pay. Jamal rolled through the streets, the sun now setting in the distance, casting long shadows on the pavement. He could feel the eyes on him, people watching, judging, whispering. It wasn't just the racist comments or the snickers anymore. It was something else, something that gnawed at him from the inside. Power. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He had taken control of his life, of his destiny. But at what cost? The questions swirled in his mind, but he didn't have time to answer them. He had bigger things to focus on now. The world around him wasn't going to change simply because he wanted it to. No, it was going to take action. It was going to take more than standing up to a few bullies on the street. It was going to take a reckoning. Jamal wasn't foolish enough to think he could do it alone. He needed allies, people who had felt the same sting of oppression, people who knew what it was like to be ignored, to be trampled on. People who would fight beside him, not for personal gain, but for justice. He thought back to the people who had made him feel like he was nothing. Blake, of course, the officer who had made his life hell for so long. But there were others too. People who had dismissed him, looked at him with pity, or worse, looked through him as if he were invisible. People who thought they had the right to define him, to decide his worth. He had seen the way they looked at him, like he was less than human, like he didn't deserve the same respect they gave others. But now, as Jamal made his way through the city, the storm inside him raged again. It wasn't enough to just make people notice him. It wasn't enough to stand up to the small-minded individuals who had always belittled him. No, Jamal had a bigger goal now. He had a vision of what the world could be, what it should be. A place where people like him didn't have to fight for a seat at the table. A place where no one was made to feel small simply because of their race, their disability, their skin color. But that vision came with its own challenges. There were those who would never accept the change he was fighting for. There were those who would resist with everything they had. Jamal knew this, and he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The battle he was about to wage wasn't just about words, it was about action. As he rolled past an old brick building, Jamal saw a group of young men standing on the corner. They looked familiar, neighborhood guys who had always looked at him with a mixture of disdain and amusement. He'd seen them around, often passing by, offering little more than a glance before moving on with their lives. But today, Jamal wasn't invisible. Today, they noticed him, and as he approached, he could feel the tension rise. One of the men, a tall figure with a rough face and a scar on his cheek, stepped forward, eyeing Jamal with suspicion. "What do you want, cripple?" he sneered. Jamal's stomach tightened, but he didn't look away. He had heard it all before, too many times. The words that people like this used to put him in his place. The words they used to remind him that he didn't belong. "I don't want anything from you," Jamal said, his voice low but steady. "But I'm not going to let you or anyone else treat me like I'm less than you." The man laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the alleyway. "You think you're something special now, huh? Just because you stood up to some punks on the street? You're still nothing. You'll always be nothing." Jamal didn't flinch. The words no longer held power over him. They used to. He had spent his entire life absorbing them, letting them seep into his bones, making him feel small, weak. But not anymore. He was done. "You think I'm nothing," Jamal said, leaning forward in his chair, his hands gripping the wheels. "Well, you don't get to decide that. I'm not a freak, and I'm not some joke for you to laugh at. You want to keep treating me like I'm beneath you? Then I'll make you understand. I'll make all of you understand." The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for the first time, Jamal saw a hint of fear in his face. The other men around him shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, unsure of what to do. "You're making a mistake, kid," the man said, his voice less sure now. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jamal didn't back down. He was done playing by the rules they had set for him. He wasn't afraid of these men anymore. He wasn't afraid of anyone. "I'm not messing with anyone. I'm just here to remind you that I matter. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to make me feel small anymore." The man took a step back, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Whatever, man," he muttered. "You're crazy." But Jamal wasn't done. Not yet. He needed to make them understand. He needed to make them see that people like him would no longer be silent. People like him would no longer be invisible. "You're right about one thing," Jamal said, his voice hard and unwavering. "I'm crazy. Crazy enough to fight back. Crazy enough to stand up to people like you. And I'm going to make sure that you and everyone like you knows that we're done being pushed around." He turned his chair and started to roll away. But as he did, he caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. It was Trey, the same guy he had confronted a few days ago. Trey's face was pale, his eyes wide as he watched the interaction from a distance. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, but Jamal could feel his gaze on him, could feel the weight of the judgment in Trey's stare. Jamal stopped and turned to face him. Trey flinched, taking a step back. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. For a moment, there was a tense silence, and then Jamal spoke, his voice quieter now, but filled with a power that made everyone around him pause. "You think I'm still the same person you can laugh at. You think I'm the same kid you used to ignore. I'm not, and I'm done letting people like you decide what I can be." Trey didn't answer. He just stared, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. Jamal could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to process the shift in the world. He could see Trey struggling to reconcile the image of the weak, invisible kid he had once known with the person standing before him now, a person who was no longer afraid, no longer silent. For a moment, the world stood still, and then, without another word, Jamal turned and rolled away. The weight of the moment settled over him as he continued down the street, the sounds of the city rising around him once more. But he knew something had changed. He had made a statement. He had taken another step forward. He wasn't going to be treated like nothing anymore, and no one was going to make him feel small again. But as Jamal made his way through the city, he knew that this was just the beginning. The battle had only just begun. The storm that had been building inside him was still there, still raging, and Jamal wasn't sure where it would lead him, but he knew one thing. He was ready to face whatever came next. The world was changing, and Jamal was going to be at the center of it. The world was on the verge of breaking. Jamal could feel it as he wheeled through the streets, his mind a storm of thoughts, each one faster and more chaotic than the last. The city that once felt like a maze of fear and oppression now seemed to pulse with a raw energy. Everything had changed since that first moment when he had stood up, when he had refused to let the world define him. He had fought for his right to exist, for his right to be seen, but as the storm inside him grew, so did the consequences. The people who had always turned a blind eye, who had mocked him or ignored him, were now paying attention, and they didn't like what they saw. It had started with small steps, confronting Trey, facing down Blake, forcing the world to see him. But now, the stakes were higher. Jamal knew the world wasn't going to just let him walk away. The power he had claimed was dangerous. It had shifted something within him, and he knew that as much as he had gained, there would be a price to pay. As he rolled through the streets, Jamal felt the weight of the glares that followed him. They were no longer subtle, no longer whispers or sidelong glances. They were open now. People saw him. They saw the storm inside him, and it terrified them. He had spent so long being invisible, so long being treated like less than nothing, and now, as he moved through the city, he was making them see him. He was making them face the truth that they couldn't ignore anymore. He mattered. But it wasn't just the strangers who were watching. It was the people he had known all his life, the people who had always been there, who had either ignored him or made him feel like he was beneath them. They saw the change in him too, and some of them didn't like it. They weren't ready for someone like Jamal to take control of his own life. They weren't ready for someone like him to stand up, to demand respect, to refuse to be a pawn in the game they had set up for him. Jamal stopped in front of the old community center, the place where he had spent so many hours as a child. He had walked past it 100 times, 100 times too many, feeling like an outsider, feeling like he didn't belong. But now, it felt different. This place, which had once represented the limits of his world, was now the symbol of his rebellion. He wheeled up the small ramp and stopped just outside the door. He didn't know what he was expecting, but the emptiness inside him, the ache from the years of pain, suddenly felt unbearable. He had done everything they told him to do. He had fought. He had stood up for himself. He had taken back his dignity, but it was still so hard. It was hard to not feel the weight of all the years that had been stolen from him. It was hard to not feel the sting of the words, the hatred, the shame that had been placed on him since the day he was born. And yet, here he was, standing, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been forced into silence, for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they were nothing. The door opened, and Jamal was suddenly face to face with someone he never thought he'd see again, his mother. She stood there, her eyes wide with shock, her face unreadable. "Jamal," she said softly, almost as if she were afraid to speak his name aloud. "What are you doing here?" Jamal didn't know how to respond. He had come here to find something, closure, maybe. Or maybe just an answer to the gnawing question that had been growing inside him. Was this really enough? Was standing up, was fighting back, really the answer to everything? His mother stepped forward, her eyes searching his face. She looked different than she used to, older, more worn down. She had always been the one to protect him, to shield him from the world, even when it felt like she didn't know how. But now, there was something in her gaze that felt like it was slipping away. She wasn't the strong, unyielding force he remembered. She was something else, someone who had been worn down by a lifetime of fighting battles she could never win. "Jamal," she said again, this time with more urgency, as if she were trying to make him understand something. "You can't change everything. You can't change the way people see you. It's too much for you to carry. I've seen this before. I've seen it in the eyes of other kids. Other people like us. They fight. They resist. But in the end, it's always the same. The world doesn't change. They don't change. Jamal felt a pang in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected his mother to be the one to doubt him. She had always been his pillar, the one who told him he could rise above it all, that he could be someone. And now, standing in front of him, she was telling him it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth the fight. "That's not true," Jamal said, his voice tight with emotion. "I'm not going to let it be the same anymore. I've spent my whole life being nothing to people like Blake, like Trey. I've spent my whole life being nothing but a target. I'm not going to let that happen anymore. I'm not going to let them get away with it." His mother's face softened, but there was still sadness in her eyes. "Jamal, you're strong. You've always been strong. But the world is cruel. It's not just going to let you win. It never does." Jamal shook his head, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak surge inside him. "I don't care anymore. I don't care if they hate me. I don't care if they think I'm too loud, too angry, too much. I'm done being quiet. I'm done letting them tell me who I am. I'm not going to live like this anymore." The silence between them was thick, suffocating, and for the first time in his life, Jamal felt like the weight of everything, his mother's fear, his own rage, his sense of injustice, had come crashing down on him. His entire life, he had been taught to survive, to be silent, to accept the roles that had been given to him. But now, the storm inside him had destroyed those walls. Now, there was no going back. His mother sighed, her shoulders slumping as she reached out and placed a hand on his. "I wish I could protect you from all of this. I wish I could tell you that it'll be okay. But the truth is, you're on your own now. You have to fight, whether you're ready or not, and there are consequences to that." Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of her words. But he also felt something else, a sense of purpose, a sense of determination that he hadn't known was possible. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He wasn't just fighting to prove them wrong. He was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been pushed aside, who had ever been made to feel less than. He was fighting to change the way the world saw people like him. "Then I'll fight," Jamal said softly, his voice steady, his resolve unshaken. "But I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for me, and for everyone who's been made to feel like they don't belong." His mother's hand tightened on his, a faint smile appearing on her face. It wasn't the smile of the woman who had raised him, the woman who had always been there to protect him. It was something else, something that said, despite everything, despite the doubts and the fears, she was proud of him. "Then go," she whispered. "Go and fight. But remember, Jamal, the fight is never over, not for people like us." Jamal turned and wheeled away, the storm inside him now a steady force. The world had tried to define him. The world had tried to break him. But he was done. He was done being their pawn. He was done being their victim. As he rolled down the street, the lights of the city flickered in the distance, the world stretching out before him. The battle had just begun, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't the same boy who had walked these streets in silence. He was someone else now. Someone who would fight. Someone who would make the world see him, make the world change. And he was ready. The final stand was just beginning, and Jamal was going to be the one to lead it. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about Jamal's journey and the challenges he faced? Have you experienced moments of racism in your own life? Your feedback means a lot to us, and we truly value each and every one of you. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It really helps us out. Wishing you a great day ahead. And if you've listened to the very end, leave us a comment with the phrase, "I matter," so we know you're with us through every part of this journey. Your voice matters.